Well, we're almost at the end of our evening of new books. But what would an evening of poetry be without a little outpouring of emotional confession? Here tonight to bring us to the point of gushing is an author who is so full of agony. He has written a 250-page book into which he has poured the contents of his weeping heart and the emotional language that it dictates. Please welcome Steve Zultanski and his Agony.
You can tell I'm alive and well because I weep continuously, given that the average person in a lifetime sheds about 4,167.921 cubic inches of tears, and that I'm somewhere around 1/3 of the way through my life, then we can assume that, so far, I've shed about 1,373.034 cubic inches of tears. Since water makes up 60% of the human body, and the volume of the average body is 5,064.97 cubic inches, then we know that the volume of water in an average human is 3,038.982 cubic inches. And so far, in my lifetime, I've shed about 45.181% of my body's water in tears, since tears are mostly water. Let me see here. We can assume that if, instead of crying now and again, at moments in which my emotions are particularly pitched, I cried all my tears at once, in one single feat of spasmodic emotional courage, I would dehydrate myself. This is perhaps why feelings are so constant, so as not to be simultaneous, which would end in dehydration. The volume of each tear, on average, is 0.012 cubic inches. So, I've shed, so far, at least 144,419.5 tears, more or less, which means that I have at least 232,907.25 tears left to shed. If I wanted to get all future crying out of the way at once, and was able, as we've implied is impossible, to narrowly focus my emotional energy into one courageous spasmodic surge, then I'd end up shedding 91.968% of my body's water at once, which is 55.181% of my body's total volume. And so, the consequences of this splurge, which would at least do me the favor of removing all future psychic obstacles from my path, which would be complete disfigurement and, I suppose, death. In fact, it seems that, in order to keep on living, a human being must be willing and able to shed his or her tears at a rather slow and regulated pace, every now and then. Say that I cry 28 times a year, which seems like an arbitrary number, but which is my age. This is kind of out of date. And which seems like a lot, but also seems about right, though perhaps I cry less if I have no lover that year. So, given that the life expectancy of a US male is 74.37 years, we can assume that I cry about 56.028 cubic inches of tears a year, in a year with a lover or lovers, and that I shed 2.001 cubic inches of tears every time I cry. However, we can also assume that I cried more tears as a child than I do as a young adult, and that I will cry less tears as an old man, hopefully, than I do as a young one. We can guess that, in the end being the end of my life, these dry spells will even out with the floods, and I'll be left with an average, as we've said, of having shed 56.028 cubic inches a year, or so. So then, each year I shed only 1.844% of my body's water. And say I drink 5 glasses of water a day. Given that each glass of water is, on average, 72.39 cubic inches, we can conclude that I drink, on average, 361.95 cubic inches of water per day, not to mention the water content of solid food. So, I drink 132,111.75 cubic inches of water a year, or 4,314.331% of my body's water. Therefore, crying at the pace at which I now cry poses absolutely no threat to my hydration as far as I could tell. But say there's a year in which I have a new lover every day, or one especially upsetting lover for the entire year, and I end up crying 3 times a day, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, for instance. Given that one doesn't cry continuously, we can guess that each crying fit lasts 10 minutes or so, on average. So, we can further assume that one sheds 0.200 cubic inches a tear a minute when crying, or 0.003 cubic inches a second. So that, if I someday live or already have lived my year of tumultuous love with either a new lover every day or one especially upsetting lover for the entire year and cry about 1,800 seconds per day, I will or did shed 22,191.095 cubic inches of tears in that year. 6.003 a day. Into my hands or onto the bare shoulder of my lover or lovers. but still in no danger of dehydration, unless, that is, as is especially a risk in the case of my one especially upsetting lover, I cry near continuously, or as close as I can get to near continuously, which would be, in this case, crying continuously while awake, given that I'd be awake for 15 hours a day, on average, or 54,000 seconds, given that I'd sleep more than usual because I'd be depressed. I now shed 162 cubic inches of tears a day, or 59,130 a year, which is 45% of the amount of water I drink from glasses. Other factors become increasingly relevant. For example, a particularly upsetting relationship does not simply consist of heartbreak, but of passionate reconciliation, followed by passionate reconciliatory sex. Remember, though, I am crying throughout. Given that one sweats during sex and dribbles some amount of saliva into one's partner's mouth and onto their body, and so on. So now, this year, I am losing quite a bit of water content due to my especially upsetting lover, onto whose shoulders I cry from the moment I wake up until the moment I fall asleep. And if we assume that 4,927,500 of my tears run down her shoulders, then we could also assume that I'm finally risking dehydration and death, leaving aside the big problems of evaporation and salt content for now or for good. Self-portrait as beautiful flower. Look at me. My right hand index finger is 3.4 inches long, whether pointing at myself or not. If I sliced 2 inches from it, it would be 1.4 inches long. I could still point at myself or at anything else. For example, this flowerless vase with a circumference of 15 inches at widest, which I used to be able to more or less comfortably grip, but which now, if I've sliced 2 inches from all my fingers, slides right out of my hands. Given that the 2-inch slice would cut directly into the knuckle of my index finger, I could then fit the leftover stub into this vase until my half a knuckle stopped up by the lip as a cork is stopped up by a bottle. This stopping is due to the knuckle's width and not to the fatness of the finger. Thus, the further slicing of my fingers would free up their essential thinness and allow for a greater versatility with regards to fitting into holes. The pinky finger of my right hand is now 0.8 inches long. The ring finger of my right hand is 1.4 inches long. The middle finger of my right hand is now 1.75 inches long. The thumb of my right hand is now 0.45 inches long. So if I sliced 2 more inches from my fingers, I'd end up cutting jaggedly into my palm, which would thus retain the same asymmetry that my hand already retains with all its fingers in full. But my arm, if measured from shoulder to scar, would stretch only for 23.75 inches, with no chance of holding this vase in any usual sense of holding, though I could still lift this vase from below by planting its foot in my palm and balancing it there as if I were a pedestal or, what is more likely, a coffee table. And instead of pointing at it in any usual sense of pointing, I could describe it in another kind of usual sense. But having no vocabulary for design or description of vases, it appears to me as pottery, generically, much as an unfamiliar taste appears to one as the generic form of spice before such generality was once again subsumed by the pretty much unavoidable nominalism of the familiar, that is, what has happened more than twice. And so my description would be without content, but would not without shape, like the empty inside of this vase, or the invisible outline where my fingers used to be, is intimated by my suggestively rounded, truncated palms, whose 5 baby pink and half-formed bulbs refer back to a time before truncation, as if there were one. So yeah. Look at this. The pinky finger of my left hand is then 0.8 inches long. The ring finger of my left hand is then 1.6 inches long. The middle finger of my left hand is then 1.8 inches long. The index finger of my left hand is then 1.6 inches long. The thumb of my left hand is then 0.45 inches long. So the ring and index fingers of my left hand are each 0.2 inches longer than the complementary fingers of my right hand, and the middle finger of my left hand is 0.05 inches longer than the other one. I didn't know this until I started measuring the length of my fingers as if 2 inches were sliced from each. But this is not getting creative in the usual sense. Getting creative in the usual sense has to do entirely with becoming a more resourceful employee, and my fantasy of slicing myself up involves instead the excessively literal subtraction of my body from the job market. When you can't point to yourself, you can't make a good employee. An employer needs you to be able to employ yourself creatively to ensure that blame is self-reflexive, not even in a more complicated spiraling involution of guilt, but first and only ever in the empty formal act of pointing, directly wholly by yourself toward yourself for any lag in performance, ability, or attitude. My left foot big toe is exactly 2 inches long. Gone. My right foot big toe is exactly 2 inches long. Gone. The remaining toes are shorter than 2 inches, and so the removal of 2 inches from each of them means the renunciation of my feet as unities. They then become infinitely divisible, like footsteps. Having 2 inches sliced from my toes definitely fucks the way I walk. It's steadier now, my fantasy, not because of a more ideal distribution of bipedal weight, but because of an increased attention to the necessary work of not falling over, which attention grants the whole affair, that is, the suggestive verticality of walking, the same kind of stiff aristocratic inevitability that plagues the actual affairs of the rich, that is, their love affairs, at least insofar as I imagine their lives to be sterile, devoid of passion even and especially at any passionate peaks, unlike, say, walking, as I used to do it before slicing off 2 inches off my toes, when it was dangerous and carried with it not only my body from one place to another, but the possibility, nay, likelihood of a fall, which is never sterile. For I am usually just like the rich, overly attentive to the miracle of uprightness, ignoring the haphazard wobble that betrays such uprightness as miraculous in the first place. That is, I exaggerate the erection of my posture in deference to the unlikely extravagance of our evolution, thus forfeiting my chances of becoming prone, without which I can know no miracles. For example, without miracles, there'd be no way to lift this vase without fingers, or to fit my short foot into its 1-inch mouth. In fact, without miracles, there's nothing much I could do with this thing except look at it, given the inches sliced away. Unless, that is, even more inches were sliced, until there were once again made open to me an active relationship to this vase. Look here, I'm about to get creative. We could slice 2 inches from each side, right and left, of my right foot, which is at widest 4.25 inches, and the remaining 0.25 inches might be still reasonably called a foot. Same for the left, though that foot is only 4.15 inches at widest, and so the remaining sliver would be even slimmer, although still, without question, a foot. Plus, my left hand is 4.5 inches at widest, which is surprising only insofar as who would have thought that one's hands and feet would have so nearly the same width at widest. So if the 2 inches were sliced off from both sides, right and left, I'd be left, as it were, with a 0.5 inch wide left hand. Same for the right hand. So now the total width of my hands and feet, which are no longer vainly boast fingers or toes, would be 1.4 inches, still too wide to fit into the 1-inch mouth of this empty vase. And given that, in my fantasy, I can only slice 2 inches off my body at a time, I cannot simply slice the excess 4 inches from one of my narrower extremities. It's not so simple. The only thing to do is to hold my hands, because I'm not agile enough to stretch my feet up to my face, and to simultaneously slice 2 inches from my face and my hands, as if they were one, say, by slicing 1.5 inches from my face and 0.5 inches from my hands, leaving me with one big 0.5-inch hand or two 0.25-inch hands, hard to say, and a slightly slimmer face, which won't necessarily directly assist in my venture to imagine myself as unemployable, but which will certainly indirectly assist in such imagining insofar as any potential employer who has to look at my mangled little face will in all likelihood be less likely to hire me, even than he or she might be if I showed up with simply worthless hands and feet dangling from my arms and legs like cut rubber bands, which perhaps at least it would be easy to grace with the shitty gift of pity, but a face asymmetrical and skimpy as everyone imagines their own to be when not looking in a mirror, when it seems that that misshapen mound of meat can't possibly show off enough of what's so special about you to account for your recognizability as a discrete continuity. Can it and will my cut up a face affect the sound of my voice? Will I sound more like a woman supposedly sounds? Because women have less of a chance of being hired when up against a male competitor, and so I'm giving up the one advantage I wonder if I even have, which is exactly what I want to do, paradise on earth, becoming absolutely lacking in advantage, the closest one can get to God, who, however you slice it, is infinitely divisible at the very least and doesn't work. Miracles are proof of only this. They don't count as work, but instances in which what's been working well enough suddenly blinks off. That is, miracles are just really bad accidents. Hands and feet together now 0.9 inches. Finally, I can fit myself into this vase. I slip 2 hands at a total of 0.5 inches and 2 feet at a total of 0.4 inches into its 1-inch mouth and curl up as worthlessly as possible. Before, when I hadn't yet systematically sliced 2 inches off my body over and over again, my time was valuable. It was worth something to someone. But now I'm only as valuable as this vase, not very, and not even continuously, like labor power, but only once upon purchase, then poof, value's gone, at least until resold. And so, yeah, since I'm no longer really worth anything as a worker, I'm worth something in and of myself, that is to say, in and of this vase I'm in. As such, I have no need for pointing, and without pointing I'm without blame, like a flower, which is maybe why flowers are beautiful. They only seem to point at you when you pay for them, and then, horrifically, like your grown-up children, never blame you for anything ever again. Instead, indifferently withering away without even the good grace to blame themselves for their own worthlessness, which might at least inspire a spasm of guilt for you, which guilt could then someday be forgotten. But it's a shame. Flowers don't arouse enough guilt for us to forget them or even repress them, but are instead so pointless as to be but barely remembered. And this here is my object, not to be ashamed, but to be a shame, a feeling pretty much impossible to recall, but which nonetheless permeates all recollection it touches, like a flower, to be but barely for you. Thank you.